never know if it could change your life. Take a chance, you're neither wrong or right. You never know if you don't roll them dice. You better roll them dice. You never know if it could change your life.
So this came up in my Sunday game, and it really threw me for a loop. And I want to get your input on this, Matt. But
I'm here.
But I'm not sure if you're aware, but they have changed the way that haste and slow interact in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. No longer do they cancel each other out the way that they used to. And I think this is because they're... Actually, you know what? I gotta be honest, I have no idea why this is the way that it is. And I wanted to...
Well, I think they sort of removed the general idea that there are spells that counter other spells.
Because darkness and daylight still function in that exact same way. They cancel out things. I thought it was a relatively elegant solution for certain types of obviously opposing spells.
Flesh to stone, stone to flesh.
Precisely. So I was running a game, and I had this instance where one of my players was hasted. They had drunk a potion of speed, and they had slow cast upon them, and I assumed that the two effects would just neutralize each other. But in fact, that is not the case.
So you could be hasted and slowed at the same time?
So listen to this. So listen to the description for haste, and then listen to the description for slow, and I want to know how you would rule it, because I ruled it they canceled, but then when we looked into it more, when I was trying to figure out how it would actually work, it did not in fact work that way. So here's haste. It's a 3rd level transmutation, as it is. Choose a willing creature, blah, blah, blah. So it's one creature, so this may be the difference. This may be why this functions the way it is. Until the spell ends, the target speed is doubled. It gains a +2 bonus to AC. It has advantage on dexterity saving throws, and it gains an additional action on each of its turns. That action can only be used to take the attack action, dash, disengage, hide, or use object, and only one extra attack, right? All right, so keep that in mind.
Okay, yeah.
So slow, you alter time around up to 6 creatures of your choice. They have to make a wisdom saving throw. An affected target speed is halved. It takes a -2 penalty to AC and dexterity saving throws. So this is interesting. Haste gives you advantage on dexterity saving throws. Slow gives you a -2. So if you were hasted and slowed, you have a -2 to saving throws, but you're making them at advantage. On its turn, it can either use an action or a bonus action, not both. So it's entirely unclear how many actions a character that is hasted and slowed gets.
Because they only get to use one.
Right.
But then they get another one?
Slow seems to indicate that no matter what,
they lose their bonus action. So this is a banana situation. Your ruling in a game makes perfect sense. It saves everyone a lot of math and headache because I don't know exactly how you're supposed to interpret it if you're both hasted and slow. I'm sure this has come up as a question before for someone on the Wizards people, but yeah.
My players looked into it, or the player who was affected looked into it, and I'm pretty sure the developers have addressed this specific situation and said, well, that's how it's written. So it's super weird, right? Because they don't actually do the same things. There are conflicting malices and bonuses. So anyway, in the future, I'm going to house rule that they cancel each other out, and I hope that everybody is happy with that. But I was alarmed to find that was not in fact the rules as written.
I mean, it makes perfect sense that they cancel each other out, and it's fine for players too, because a hasted enemy fighter is super deadly, or a hasted enemy rogue, and so having that wizard with a slow spell, it's I can take that down, and even if I can't, I could just slow the enemies. I mean, I would, regardless of what they come up with, or a simpler way of recording how many actions you have when you're both hasted and slowed, I would just go with they cancel each other out because I don't care.
Yeah, I also made a mistake in the same session by not reading the rules closely enough. So the player who was hasted was a fighter, a dual-wielding fighter. So they normally get 3 attacks.
Right. Extra attack, a bonus attack.
Right. Extra attack and a bonus attack. And so they assumed that with another attack action, that would give them 2 additional attacks. Though haste specifically says, reading it now, just 1 additional attack. They also used action surge that round, and I very nearly threw the book at them. I was not happy to have to sit through 7 attacks in 5th edition. I thought I had left that behind me with Pathfinder and 3.5. I now know that is not the case, even if they want to burn haste and action surge and all that, but it is not the way that you think it would work, as it turns out.
That's a funny case. Yeah, I'm sure some idiot somewhere has thought up what's the most attacks you could get at the lowest level. It's probably something like that: haste, dual wielding, fighter, action surge.
Pretty sure that maybe there's something a monk can do to get more, but
right, they can spend key points.
But maybe I think the most that you can get is in fact 5 or 6. I don't even want to count it out. It makes my head hurt thinking about it. But it's not 7, which is what I thought it was. So if you're listening, Dungeon Masters, be aware that the rules are not always going to be on your side, and sometimes they're going to be super unclear.
Well, that's the principle of your fair judgment as referee in the moment is probably 90% of the time going to be better than whatever solution you come up with by looking at the rules for next time, right?
Right. And as long as you communicate to your players that, look, sometimes I'm going to make rulings to keep the game moving, and we just have to be okay with that, then hopefully everybody's on the same page and nobody will get frustrated or...
And you got to decide what's that principle that you're going to use at your table to make rulings, right? And when you're making a ruling, you got to be like, even take a step back from, I'm writing the NPCs, the players are writing their characters. This is me as the neutral arbiter, and what's the principle you're going to base it on? The letter of the rules, and we're all going to spend time looking it up. What seems logical or consistent with the way we've been playing, right? Which is what you picked and what I prefer as well. Or you can go with what seems most fun. What drives the story best?
One thing that
all of those are valid.
Yeah, one thing that you could do, depending on what kind of game that you're running, is that instead of having your spells cancel each other out, like Daylight and Darkness do or whatever, you could have them explode or create a third additional effect or something like that. House rules something a little bit more interesting than just, they neutralize each other. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. As long as you communicate.
Yeah, you could create something completely different, like a zone of wild magic that exists for a round that has a chaos effect. Well, let me tell you about what happened in one of my games this week. So I've been playtesting a hack of 5th edition D&D and the acclaimed indie game Dogs in the Vineyard called Paladins in the Vineyard, where you're paladins and you go around from religious community to religious community, solving problems, righting wrongs, and to some regard enforcing doctrine. I got the game already. I was playing it online. I had to load everything up to Roll20, which I had not done before. I sit down with my players, and these are all players I trust. I've played with them for a long time. I go over the spiel of the game, right? I say, okay, you're all junior paladins in a West that never was, going from town to town. This is inspired by the days of the Mormon frontiers. And one of my players just said, I love playing your games, Matt, but this game makes me feel uncomfortable. I don't think I can play it. And I was like, okay, well, we'll do something else. But I was very surprised by that, and I had to take a step back and think about some of the more unsavory bits of Dogs in the Vineyard.
That's super interesting, and I guess in retrospect, that's not super surprising. This goes back to what we talked about in one of our earliest episodes about a Session Zero, and about how important it is to set expectations and be very clear about what kind of game you're trying to play.
Right. And this was just a one shot. So the Session Zero was 10 minutes at the beginning.
So this was relatively low impact for Matt. I'm sure Matt, you were disappointed that, you didn't end up getting to play, but also the amount of time spent getting to that point was relatively minimal. And that's why we talk about doing a Session Zero and why
we have emphasized repeatedly how important it is. So this is a great example of sometimes when it doesn't go how you expect it to, but I think it really reinforces the importance of preparation and good communication with your players.
And I totally respect a player to always say, this is not something I want to play, either because it doesn't sound fun or it gives me a little bit of a queasy feeling. Dogs in the Vineyard, I think, is set up where you have to, you come in as modern players enforcing a system of morality that is a little bit alien to you, right? The sort of fantasy religion based on Mormonism is very much about traditional gender roles, a little bit of settler colonialism and polygamy thrown in, which to me doesn't seem all that different from any of the fantasy games we play, which all of them assume some kind of morality that is a little bit alien to ourselves, right? If we live in a medieval world, the idea that we would have kings and lords and stuff like that makes me queasy. Players usually don't have a problem filling that in, but when you throw kind of sex into it, I think it's thing. I think Dogs in the Vineyard has a little bit of a problem with that, in that it gets the titillation from the players out of having weird sexual norms, and it sort of banks on that, and that's kind of I don't really like that either.
Yeah, and that's interesting because it does raise questions about role playing, because if you're not necessarily signing on to that particular worldview or set of social mores by role playing a character that happens to be a religious crusader or be polygamous or have unusual or beliefs and behaviors that don't align to your own. I often like to, not in RPGs, but in strategy games, play a ruthless capitalist, even though, things that could not be further from the way that I live my actual life, because it's a fun, role-playing opportunity. That also brings up questions of what's fun for your players. And I think that there's something about tabletop role-playing games that makes it's harder, I think, even if you're a very good role player, to separate the actions of your character from what you actually feel.
And to give Dogs in the Vineyard a little bit of credit is that your characters have, after they're given this sort of setting and set of moral norms, they're given complete leeway in interpreting them, right? The game specifically says you have to do what you think is right. And if you decide that this is wrong, you're kind of creating new doctrine or something like that. For players that I've had that have grown up in Utah, which I've had a few, found the game super interesting. But I can completely understand why you wouldn't want to buy into this kind of weird thing. And I'd love to be able to hack this setting together where you have a little bit of a more nobler set of principles you have to enforce.
So, hopefully, players, Dungeon Masters, you found something useful and interesting from our daily or our weekly report. I hope that it indicates how even for experienced DMs, things don't always go the way that you anticipate, and you have to learn to improvise in two radically different ways. But the main thing that we wanted to talk about, and it has taken us a little ways to get there, but I wanted to talk about this round table that happened this week. And they've done one of these before, and it's 5 DMs. Mike Merles, Matt Mercer, Adam Coble. By the way, I realize now that in one of our early episodes we talked about the first round table, and I mentioned that Adam Coble was a moderately successful Twitch DM, which was actually the title of our episode. Unfortunately, I'm a dumbass and that's wrong. He is a moderately successful Twitch DM, but he also wrote Dungeon World. So
a very successful
RPG and a very good RPG. So I sold him aggressively short, and I apologize to Adam Coble, who's absolutely listening to our podcast. Hi, Adam. How are you doing? So it's Matt Mercer, Adam Coble, Matt Mercer. Sorry, I already said Matt Mercer. Mike Merles, and Matthew Colville. And it's put on by Roleplay, which...
It's also super confusing because there's 2 Matts and 2 Covilles. and there's some overlap there. So you need a Venn diagram.
Yes. So we're going to work real hard to enunciate words here because one of them is Kobold.
I'm against that.
One is Colville, and there are several Matts. So just try to bear with us, team. And we'll put a link to this roundtable in the show notes because it's absolutely worth listening to. It's put on by Roleplay, which is a YouTube Twitch channel which does a bunch of D&D content. I'm not familiar with them. There was a host whose name I am forgetting.
It's not important.
It's not important. I mean, I'm sure he's a nice guy and he's smart. He did a good job of moderating the roundtable. But I wanted to talk about what they talked about on the roundtable because obviously these are some very experienced DMs. They also 3 out of 5 of them do some sort of streaming. I guess counting Matt Colville, who will be starting a streaming service or a streaming game soon. And so they have a lot of interesting perspective, both having been DMs and game designers, but also being public facing. And so I thought they had a lot of really interesting things to say. So I have a whole list of
all right, let's hear it.
So I wanted to start about, so one of the early things that they talk about is they warmed up by talking about getting players for their streaming games to invest and getting viewers to invest in those players and those characters, sorry. And they mentioned, I thought this was really interesting and I wanted to get your input on that. They mentioned how useful backgrounds were in a environment where players are expected to die. Does that make sense? So they really leaned on, they really like the idea of saying, hey, look, your character just died. Why don't you roll on this like list of backgrounds and traits from Xanathar's and from the player's handbook and get started and then build your character from there. And I thought that was a very interesting position to take. I don't know what you thought about that, Matt.
Yeah, I don't know. The whole roundtable is talking about this weird dichotomy of like pleasing your players and pleasing your viewers. I would never, if I killed a character, right, because that's what they're talking about, make them roll randomly to create a new character, right? You've already punished a player enough, right? Maybe they don't feel like the character death was punishment, right? Maybe they thought it was earned or something like that. But regardless, something bad has happened to them. I would never then force them say, hey, now your new character, their origins are dictated by fate. Right.
Yeah, and that was interesting.
The reward of dying is that you get to make a character, which most players find fun.
That was interesting. I think that in the context of their games, they're working with mostly experienced role players, and that they would find that an interesting challenge. But it's for your home games, it is needlessly punishing, I think, because a player already died. And this sort of transitions into it's sort of part of the same conversation. Character death. And I wanted to get your opinion on this, Matt, because they were talking about how it's...
I'm for it.
For it. I am also for character death.
I kill a character every day.
They were talking about, all of them were talking about how if there isn't the threat of death, then it feels cheap and the players aren't invested. And for those of them that do public-facing games, the viewers are not invested. And you get accusations of plot armor and,
if there's no death, the game is just fancy pretending.
Yeah,
right.
And I agree. So this is something that I consistently am bad at. I'm extremely bad at balancing games for death, and I don't have a solution for this. I have trouble tuning games to be the right amount of challenge, and it is something that I perpetually am trying to work on, but especially with the new 5th edition rules, which I have to admit I am not used to when it comes to death. I have trouble making my players feel like death is always around the corner. Matt, how have you had much luck with this?
Yeah, I think one strategy you can take is to think about it from the perspective of your NPCs and monsters and organizations that players are working with or against, right? What the hell do they want, right? When players come up against a monster, is it trying to eat them? Is it trying to survive and get away? Is it trying to discourage them from coming? Or is it a villainous organization that was hired specifically to try and kill as many of them as possible, right? And sort of, you should know, what the stakes of that encounter is, and the players should know, right? There's a bunch of assassins. They're going to try and take as many of you out as they can, versus it's a Manticore. If it can, it will knock you all unconscious and then eat one of you. Like, what's their goal death wise, right? And so the threat is always there, but there are some encounters more than others where the NPCs are specifically looking to kill your characters as opposed to just defeat them.
Right. And that's always hard for me because it feels cruel and also malicious unless it's, I don't know, a nemesis or a particularly vicious NPC to attack a player that's unconscious. And it has always felt that way. It feels like a really weird thing for anyone to do in combat. Like if anyone is still alive, they're going to focus on somebody who's a threat rather than putting a crossbow bolt through the head of somebody who's on the ground. So,
which is why you gotta communicate that to your players beforehand, right? This is a creature that wants death, right? It feeds off death, or it's a group of assassins that if they can't take you all down, they're gonna try and take one of you down. And then it feels less cheap if you sort of make sure your players know.
Yeah, it is something that I struggle with, and it is, I think, one of the harder things to do. Matt Mercer's game, I think, does a really good job of every combat feels sufficiently challenging, and he so far I've noticed players go down, they are at risk of dying, there are real stakes, and one of the things I've been impressed with. I'm sure not all of his encounters like that, but of the second season so far, they've all been pretty well tuned, and I've been very impressed. One thing that I thought was really interesting that came up after that is...
I'm not in love with the 5th edition death save mechanic. I feel like that's a little bit of the problem.
Yeah, I don't know. I like the simplicity of it, but the balance of it is weird. It feels like it's a lot harder for characters to die. It feels like side of some either extremely massive damage or a string of very bad luck that a player isn't going to die. It takes 3 rounds, assuming they're not being stabbed, assuming they fail all of their saving throws to die. And most combats are over well before 3 rounds have passed.
In 3 rounds, they have 3 or 4 companions, all of which have several ways to stabilize them by casting a cantrip, healing them any damage, using a med kit. So, if you want to kill a character without wiping the party, it seems like you really have to make that DM decision to attack an unconscious creature, which you said you always struggled with. And that's why I kind of don't like it, is the DM has to make the choice to say, all right, you're down and out. This time the monsters aren't going to attack you, but this other time they're going to, stab your unconscious corpse, which sucks.
Yeah, I keep saying it's just hard to get right, but that brings me to something that I forget. I think it was Matt Colville who mentioned failure that's not death, and this I am much better at. One thing that I will do is that I will often set up situations where if the players, maybe they won't die, but if they don't perform particularly well in the combat, or if they fail to act aggressively enough to address a situation, then a favored NPC will die. This is something I do all the time. I kill off NPCs left and right. I love doing it, and I love making my players feel bad because they didn't try hard enough to save them. Another thing that you can do that I have also done is have them miss out on loot. I had a dungeon recently where there were many tomes for stat boosts that they could earn if they were willing and able to solve challenges deftly, and they missed out on some very valuable loot. And I that was a type of failure that they felt quite acutely that wasn't charactered.
Right. Mechanical things that they could get that they lose, or narrative failure, are just as good as player death. For sure.
That was something, actually, that this is sort of, there's something else that came up that Matt Colville brought up, and I don't remember which edition it was. I think maybe it was 2nd edition, but it was that if you were resurrected or if you were raised from the dead, your constitution went down a point permanently. And that was punishing, and I don't know that that's the kind of thing that you want to go back to, especially if your players are dying a lot. But it does sort of adds a element of permanence and a sort of like a ticking clock with a very long timeline, but a real threat of a real cost to being dead, I guess. And that was sort of interesting. And you can tie that in with something like an injury. Every point of constitution missed is you got a limp now, or you lost an eye, or you've got permanent damage to your
You've got
Soul damage, yes.
You're becoming more ghost-like or something like that. I like the... I think it's up for DMs to decide, and you can decide as you begin playing the game at lower levels, right? Once players get to higher levels or get enough resources that they can hire someone to cast Resurrection or Raise Dead, that is this going to be pretty much only a material cost, so that when a character dies, it's up to that player. Should I bring this character back, or is it time to start a new thing? And that's an acceptable way. Or, you can just say these things are really hard to get to, or you can say the Eberron setting sort of tries to emphasize that. If you die, it's really hard to bring people back.
Matt Mercer...
Or you can just say these spells don't
Matt Mercer mentioned this, actually, and it happened in the first season of Critical Role, and I have not seen this episode, so if you're a fan and you know about this, don't get mad at us, but I'm just going back on what he said during the roundtable, but one of his players, Scanlan, I think was played by Taliesin. The character is Scanlan. The person is Taliesin, I think. Again, correct me if I'm wrong. Anyway, he died. The player character Scanlan died, and he wasn't going to bring him back. He was like, "Look, my arc is finished. I'm going to roll a new character. I'm satisfied with what happened to me." But then the other players developed a narrative reason for him to return, and that created a really interesting dynamic. But Matt brings up a good point about how it's up to, if the cost is high enough, the players have to make a decision about whether or not, do I want to come back? Do I want to continue playing this character, or is this the end of their journey? And that for a long time, until you get to a certain high level and it's just, no big deal to bring people back, it's still a relatively challenging decision to make.
And that makes me wonder, though, really what the pressure was. Was the pressure from the other players, or was it from the viewers that wanted to see this character continue? I imagine, with something like Critical Role or, these other extremely popular live streams, viewers get very attached to these characters, right? I'm for killing them more often, but...
Yeah. I mean, killing players is... Or, don't kill players. Kill characters. Do not kill your players. You don't hear that here. But yeah, killing characters is good. And if you can find a way to do that and make it challenging and narratively powerful, then that's a great and important thing to do.
One last thing about character death that was brought up in the stream. They all sort of had this idea of there is good player or character death and bad character death, right? Your character goes out in some epic fight. That happens sometimes, and I'm for that. But I am not afraid to let characters die for just shitty reasons, right? That's sort of a more George R. R. Martin thing. Sometimes, people just get unlucky.
Yeah, and that's the thing.
It's not all world-changing destiny.
Everybody wants their character to die in an epic fashion in an important fight, but you can't orchestrate that, and you can't expect that. It's great if it does happen, but we're running games where lots of things are deadly, not just the boss battle at the end. Every trap potentially, or every bad encounter with the city watch, if you shoot your mouth off, can end up with your character dead if you're doing a bad job. And I agree with Matt. I think sometimes the Goblin Shaman gets a crit on his Scorching Ray at level 1 and your character is dead. And that's just the way things go. And I think that's one of the things that makes D&D so interesting and challenging, and that you need to lean into that. Obviously, if you've had a character around for a long time, you want them to go out in a blaze of glory, but your players should probably not expect that, and you should definitely not. You don't need to try to make everything epic, I guess, if you don't want to. Sometimes players or player characters will just die. One thing that was interesting, that this isn't something that they brought up specifically, but it is something that I was thinking about as I was listening to it, is, do you think, so I think that it's sort of useful to imagine, even if you are not somebody who is streaming your game, that you have an audience. Because I like to think of Dungeons & Dragons as I have said before, a shared narrative experience, a collaborative storytelling game.
Yeah.
And I think the idea of having an audience, how is this going to play for the audience? Is this engaging? Is this interesting to watch? Is a great way to think about structuring your games to make them interesting to your players and to you.
Yeah, I guess that's fine. I think of you got to think of your players as both players and audience, right? They're the only ones you have to please. And so you can just, at least for me, imagine that the audience is filled with 10 clones of each of your players, right? And they're either cheering or booing or on the edge of their seats or
Exactly.
bored.
Exactly right. So I thought that was interesting, and I think it was not intuitive to me when streams started becoming big, and it's still not entirely intuitive to me, but I do think it has introduced some useful ideas and themes into Dungeons and Dragons and helped dungeon masters think about being interesting and having their players have fun. I know it's been a long time since we've been in sort of the adversarial DM style. Like Tomb of Horrors is well behind us, but I do think that until recently there were a lot of DMs who saw themselves as either entirely neutral arbiters or as adversaries to their players. And I don't think either of those are entirely right, because you want...
Right, can you imagine watching a stream of a DM that's just a neutral arbiter or just trying to kill players left and right? It would be super boring.
Rest in peace, respect to him, but I can't imagine Gary Gygax being very much fun to watch be a DM, because of the type of dungeon mastering that he liked and pioneered and built into his modules.
Yeah, it would be super boring. I think, streaming has changed the game. I'm not too worried about, I think it's brought, like you said, positive things to the way we all play, or the way the majority of people play. The paradox of streaming, though, has me worried of, it seems like the goal, there are so many actual play podcasts and YouTube and Twitch streams. It seems like the goal now of every great DM and aspiring great Dungeons and Dragons player is to have a Twitch stream with 1 million followers, and I worry about that.
I agree.
Right? Is that what the hobby
yes.
needs? Should that be Matt Colville's goal? I mean, he can do whatever he wants. People are going to give him money, so maybe it should be if that's what he wants to do. But I wish Matt Colville would take his $1 million instead of streaming and fucking start a new game.
Yeah, I agree. So we didn't talk about this, and I'm not sure if we'll have time to go into it too deeply, but Matt Colville just launched a very successful Kickstarter, $1 million Matt Colville. Now, one of the most successful, I think, role-playing Kickstarters ever. And great for him. Part of it, but it's two parts. So part of it is he's writing and publishing a book on strongholds, which looks neat, and we'll hopefully talk about that sometime soon. But the second part is getting equipment and funding to start streaming his own game. And I love Matt Colville. I have a lot of respect for him. I think he's a great DM. I really enjoy his videos. I don't know that I agree with Matt. I don't know that this is the right move for him. I don't know that he needs to have a stream. He's a game designer, and a narrative. I think he writes for a video game company. I don't know that this needs to be the end goal for every DM.
Right, and I feel like streaming, it's because it's so popular and, celebrity creating, right? No one, looks at, I look at someone like Chris Perkins, and I'm like, this guy is a brilliant game designer for his amazing work in the design of various editions, for his phenomenal The Dungeon Master's Corner column and advice that has helped me. But other people are like, oh, Chris Perkins, he runs that Acquisitions Incorporated thing. I'm like, I don't give a shit about that.
And so, Matt and I have a podcast, and we obviously at least enjoy hearing our...
Oh, we're getting fucking meta
enjoy
now.
Hearing our own voices and performing for other people.
This is... Now we've admitted that this is a podcast and not just a conversation with friends.
The point I'm trying to make here is that we understand...
The fourth wall's broken.
We understand the appeal. And, I don't know that if somebody just handed me a bunch of money and said, here, film yourself DMing, I wouldn't say no. But that doesn't seem like a natural endpoint for me. I do want to create #D&D content, but... I would rather produce a podcast and short videos and talk about the game rather than demonstrate my talent and skill as a DM on a Twitch stream. I agree that there is a pressure, it seems, given the success of Acquisitions Incorporated and Critical Role, that if you're a good DM, a popular DM with a platform, then naturally you're going to want to stream your home game. And I don't know that that's the case.
Yeah, I just think there's got to be, there should be two equal paths for people who are good at this shit. And one should be streaming Twitch shit for the masses, and the other should be writing new stuff so that people can do their own thing with it. I would love it if Matt Colville produced 2 hardcover books a year, but it seems like he's going to make this Stronghold book, which I'm going to buy, but I'm not terribly excited about Stronghold rules. I would love for him to write another adventure for 5th edition or something like that.
And again, he can do whatever he wants with his Kickstarter money, but I do think that his talents would be better spent elsewhere. But this brings me to the next thing they talked about on the stream that I was really interested to talk to you about. They all seem to think, including Mike Merles, that the barrier to entry and the qualifications for being a game designer are in fact very low. They don't seem to think that the actual process of designing content and encounters and stats for Dungeons and Dragons is particularly difficult, or that it needs to be, you know, gate kept in any way, shape, or form. And I'm of two minds about this, but I'm curious what you think, Matt.
Okay, well, the barrier to entry is low in that supposedly anyone can do it. Posted on this, they're praising the Wizards of the Coast run DMs Guild as this beautiful marketplace of ideas, which it sort of is, but the barrier to entry is low. The barrier to success is high, right? You look at what the sales on the DMs Guild is, and it's mostly like Matthew Mercer's homebrew stuff has been the top of the charts forever because people are familiar with it. And if I post something on there and it doesn't have professional editing, if it doesn't have original art, no one's going to buy it, even if it's a name your own price.
Well, I want to circle back around to sales, but I think the point that they were making was that anybody can design their own class, and there's no reason why you have to, or their own, you know, content, and there's no reason why you have to wait for official Wizards approval or whatever. But I don't know that I entirely agree with that, and the reason why I think that maybe encouraging everybody to just go and be a game designer is if you take a look at D&D Wiki or any of the community sources of homebrew content,
we've gone
genuinely
to a dark
do not
place.
know if your average dungeon master can be trusted to make mature decisions about homebrew content. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I would, if that's our sample size, I think you look at it and half of the things are ridiculous jokes, and the other quarter are like Mary Sue, Gary Sue classes that are just amazing at everything, and the other half just don't make any sense.
I thought that was interesting for these professional DMs to say, and I applaud them for saying, look, anybody can do this. But I think that they've been doing it for so long that I'm not sure that they recognize that there is some challenge to balancing correctly and to making wise decisions and to also creating something that needs to be created. One thing that we have remarked on before is that there's just an absolutely obscene amount of classes and subclasses homebrewed on all over the place. You can find any number of homebrewed classes and subclasses, but if you wanted to find homebrewed settings, or especially homebrewed adventures or one-shots, those are far, far harder to find on DM's Guild or anywhere.
Right, which is what people should really want, right? I would much rather have a book with 10 new monsters, 10 new magic items, 10 new NPCs than one with 10 new subclasses. But that's not what the average DM is interested in.
So I thought it was an interesting point for them to make, and I do agree somewhat. And I do, obviously, we encourage people to homebrew and to work on their own stuff. It is, I think, something that a lot of DMs and GMs get into too early without having this, an adequate grounding in playing the game, and they tend to make some mistakes.
The last thing about the barriers to entry being low is 5th edition, thank God, right? We wouldn't have any of this if they hadn't have brought back the open gaming license that they had under 3rd edition. They got rid of under 4th. Unlike 3rd edition, the open gaming license is a little more restrictive. For a while, Eldritch Eldritch Blast wasn't in there, so it was really hard to make anything for the Warlock. The Battlemaster maneuvers are not in there, which open up a lot of options for NPCs, and if you want to make your own, since we're talking about making your own subclasses, I just wish they would include almost everything except for maybe their trademarked monsters in the open gaming license. They're not going to lose any sales. It's just going to increase creativity.
Wizards' defense of their IP is one of the more and perpetually frustrating things about the company's business decisions, and has been for decades. And the less that we have to say about that, the better. That Mike Mearls was talking about this. They mentioned that players really, and this relates to the work that we're doing, really want to know the numbers around like how many people are playing, book sales, etc. And he was speculating that it has to do with the prestige of RPGs. That they want confirmation that these games are prestigious enough or popular enough, or that they want to be able to demonstrate that they have a wide enough reach, and that is sort of that is something I relate to, and it's sort of interesting. It seemed like the people on the round table didn't think that was a particularly like motivating way to think, and I understand that too. But where Matt specifically is working on a set of data about the growth of 5th edition, and it does make me wonder about this.
Yeah, I think the analysis that was put forth in the roundtable is correct in that 5th edition has grown the player base for the first time since the 1980s, which is why it's amazing, right? At the end of the day. There is something to be said with, now that we're all connected with Twitch streams and forums and stuff like that, you want to be part of this exciting movement, right? There's nothing wrong, and your joy is supposedly not lessened if you're playing the first edition of Mage the Ascension.
Right.
But very few people are playing that anymore. And if you're part of a game that lots of other people are playing, then it's super cool, right? I meet people and you're like, oh, in my game we were doing this, in my game we're doing that. And if you're not part of the same sort of fracturized sub-community, it's harder to have those conversations.
I mean, as somebody who has run non-standard games like Shadowrun and Savage Worlds, which I love very much, it can be frustrating because the communities are so small and isolated. It's so much harder to get answers to questions. It's so much harder to find bonus content, maps, and other things that you might need to flesh out your game with anything besides D&D 5th edition, to be quite frank. The communities are there and there are people working in them, especially in certain games, but it's just compared to what you can find and the answers that you can get and how many people you feel like you're a part of, 5th edition is just far and away the best to work with.
And this builds on the point that I think Matthew Mercer is sort of tepidly introduced, which is, Wizards, we love all the unified Forgotten Realms thing, but I would love to see some Dark Sun and some Planescape and stuff like that. And maybe Wizards is right. If you're not all part of the same thing, then your community feels isolated. If you're only one of 1,000 game masters that's running Spelljammer, then you're not going to find the stuff. But I don't know if that's completely true, at least within a subdivision of 5th edition, because everything's so easy to port and mod around. Wizards has got to break out of its Forgotten Realms thing. It's so
and I was so happy to hear Mercer say that on a stream to Mike Mearls.
Right, because he's got some pull. He's the big boy.
Because I agree, obviously we agree completely. We've talked about this before, and it's so nice to see that we're not the only ones who really feel like an opportunity is being missed here. Yeah, that was actually one of the last things that I wanted to talk about, was Mercer bringing up other settings and how there's a real opportunity there, because they were talking about what kind of books that Wizards was going to put out next, and I agree with Mercer, and I think Matt Colville said the same thing, that maybe some different settings. Maybe some diversity of types of player themes.
And we feel like the voice crying in the wilderness sometimes, harping on please make different types of campaigns. And the sort of party line given in this roundtable was, Tomb of Annihilation's very different. It's a hex crawl. It's not really that different. It's got dungeons. It's got wilderness exploration. It's marginally different than the other things. But And this is where I think Paizo excels for all the flaws of the adventure paths, and there are many. They are very different types of adventures put in there. Wizards is so far, maybe they took the lesson from Paizo that everything needs to be set in the same campaign setting. Just like Paizo has Golarion, we have Forgotten Realms. And so we're not leaving that.
Colville also made an interesting... This was all in the context of the conversation about like what kind of book Wizards is going to come out with next, but he mentioned the Draconomicon, which was I think a 3.5 supplement or a 3rd edition supplement, which was just about dragons and dragon prestige classes and dragon races and things like that. And he was like, "Hey, that's a great idea," and I actually agree very strongly with him. I think that would be a really cool way for Wizards to go with their books from here on out, is to get really niche into a topic. And this is again, we're always going to go back to Eberron. Eberron did this really well. They would pick Dragons of Eberron, for example, or Magic of Eberron, or Faiths of Eberron, and really get super granular and offer a bunch of background and specific stories and information about how to get really specific about your faith, or about being involved with the dragons, or about how, if you were a certain type of magic user. And I think that would be a very cool way for Wizards to go from here on out.
Well, we're hoping like Mike Merle's caught a brainworm from these various comments, and he's going to go back to the Monday morning conference meeting at Hasbro headquarters and say, all right, our next book is going to be an urban campaign set in Sharn. Half of it will be information about Sharn and Eberron. The other half will be a suite of urban adventure.
We're hoping,
but I
probably not. We're
happen.
hoping. I am. So Kate Welch has tweeted about working on a new book, and I am excited to see what she is working on. I hope that it is something new and interesting, and I have faith that it will be. Anything else you want to talk about with regards to the roundtable? Anything that I didn't cover? I think that's most of my notes.
Yeah, it's good to see that Wizards is able to engage all these people in conversation. I wish they would obviously Matt Mercer is too cool to be hired by Wizards of the Coast, but I wish they would just hire the rest of these
especially Colville. I wish they would just hire Colville and have him be on staff permanently. He has great ideas. I would trust him to do a great job.
Yeah. Or Colville, listen to us. Take your millions of dollars, do your streaming, but also found a new gaming company.
Do another Kickstarter to start a new gaming company. We'll fund it. We'll pay in at the highest level. We're on board.
I'll give you another $20.
All right. Well, that's it for today, adventurers, dungeon masters. Hope you found this useful. We will talk to you next time.